Good morning to all. My name is Himanshu Srivastava. Today we'll read the story Triumph of Surgery by James Harriet. This video includes line-wise explanation and summary. The link for the notes of this chapter is in the description box of this video. So let's start the chapter. This video starts with this chapter. A small dog Tricky, which is pampered and overfed by his rich mistress. He falls seriously ill and his mistress consults a veterinary surgeon. Does he perform an operation? Does the doctor recover? That we'll read in the story. This story is about Tricky, a dog who is the pet of a rich lady named Mrs. Pumphrey. She loves her dog very much and is unable to refuse him anything he wants. Tricky is fond of eating cream cakes and chocolates. So one day when Mrs. Pumphrey is out with Tricky for a walk, the narrator sees them and stops to talk. While talking to Mrs. Pumphrey, he realizes that she has been overfeeding Tricky and also had been giving him things that he should not eat, due to which Tricky had started looking like a blotted sausage. Soon Tricky got unwell, and Mrs. Pumphrey has to call Mr. Harriet, the narrator, who was a doctor, veterinary doctor. She does not want to send him away, but the only way suggested by Mr. Harriet is to get him hospitalized for 15 days. Then the story unfolds into how he gets well. Now we will read the description. I was really worried about Tricky this time. I had pulled my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. He had become hugely fat, like a blotted sausage, with a leg at each corner. His eyes became his eyes, bloodshot and rummy, stared straight ahead and his tongue rolled from his jaws. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain. He was so listless, Mr. Harriet. He seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition, so I have been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up. Some malt and cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. And did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak I had to relent. He does love cream cakes and chocolate, so I can't bear to refuse him. I looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night, and I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey had not mentioned. Are you giving him plenty of exercise? Well, he has his little walks with me, as you can see, but Hawkins, the gardener, has been down with lumbago, so there has been no riding throwing lately. No ring throwing lately. This is the word meaning. The narrator starts telling that how he was worried about Tricky, a pet dog. The narrator, Mr. Harriet, stops his car as he sees Tricky with his mistress on the road, as the narrator is shocked to see Tricky because he looks like a blotted sausage. He has become very fat. His eyes are red and watery. Mrs. Pumphrey, Tricky's owner, starts giving explanations. She told Mr. Harriet that she thought that Tricky was malnourished because he did not have any energy and excitement. She told him that she used to give him malt, cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks at night, apart from his regular meals, so that he could sleep at night. Although she gave him so much to eat, she says that she does not give him much to eat. Then the narrator asks her if she had cut down on his sweets as he had asked her to do, which she replies that she did it for a while, but she felt that he was getting weaker, because of which she had to stop being so harsh with him. Also, she says that she is unable to refuse him cakes and chocolates, as those were his favorite things. Then the narrator understood Tricky's problem. The dog was very greedy and could eat at any time of the day. He did not know how to say no to food when his stomach was full. The narrator also thought to himself of all the things that Mrs. Pumphrey would not have mentioned, which she felt tricky. Again, the narrator asked Mrs. Pumphrey whether Tricky was exercising, to which Mrs. Pumphrey replies that she does take him out for walks once in a while, but he is not playing his ring throwing exercise, as the gardener who takes him out to play is not coming these days because of pain in his lower back. Narrator tried to sound severe. Now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. You must harden your heart. Keep him on a very strict diet. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I am sure you are right, but it is so difficult, so very difficult. She set off, head down, along the road, as if determined to put the new rhyme into practice immediately. I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. I thought it would not be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. I expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bout of vomiting. He spent all his time lying on a rug, panting. Did not want to go for walks, did not want to do anything. I had made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight to be kept under observation. The poor lady almost swooned. She was sure she would pine and die if he did not see her every day. But I took a firm line. Tricky was very ill, and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay, and followed by Mrs. Pomfrey's wailings, I marched out to car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. The narrator tried to talk seriously to Mrs. Pomfrey that if she did not control Tricky's eating habits and increased his exercise, he would soon fall ill. He told her that she should stay strong and stick with him and put him on a diet. Mrs. Pumphrey accepted that, although she knew that Mr. Harriet was right, but it was too difficult for her to refuse him for anything. But then she left the place as if she was now ready to follow the new routine properly. Mr. Harriet was watching them go and looking at Tricky walking unsteadily. The narrator was also looking at the tweed coat that Tricky was wearing. He had a wardrobe full of these coats and also raincoat for the rainy days. This line also suggests that Mrs. Pumphrey was a rich lady as she had a lot of money to spend on her dog. But the narrator knew that soon he would be receiving a call about Tricky falling ill, and it came. The call came after a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was very upset as Tricky was not eating anything, not even his favorite dishes, and was vomiting frequently. He did not even want to do anything. Being a veterinary doctor, the narrator knew that the only way to get Tricky well was to get him out of the house for a few days. He then suggested to Mrs. Pomfrey that it would be good to get Tricky hospitalized and keep him under observation for 15 days. Upon hearing this, Mrs. Pomfrey nearly fainted. She was sure that if Tricky did not see her every day, he would surely die. But the narrator kept his words. He told her that this was the only option as Tricky was very ill. The narrator thought it would be best to avoid any delays and get him to the hospital as soon as possible. He went to their house, and even though Mrs. Pomfrey was crying because she did not want her dog to go away from her, he took the dog, wrapped it in a blanket, and put him in the car. The entire staff was roused, and maids rushed in and out bringing his day bed. His night bed, favorite cushions, toys, and rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, super bowl. Realizing that my car would never hold all the stuff, I started to drive away. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry threw an armful of the little coats through the window. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. I patted the head, and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Poor old lad, I said, you haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. At the surgery, the household dogs surged round me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes and, when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing round him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. For 2 days I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third day, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe, the greyhound, and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tris- Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. There was the unusual headlong rush followed by the sounds of high speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. These are the word meanings. This may also help you out. The maids were then woken up and asked to get out all of the tricky stuff. His stuff included things like his bed, night bed, favorite cushions, toys, rubber, rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, and his snack bowl. Mr. Harriet knew that so much stuff won't fit in his car, so he started rushing things. As the doctor was living with Tricky, Mrs. Pumphrey threw a lot of coats that Tricky used to wear in the car. As the narrator was turning the car on the turn, he saw through the rear mirror that everyone was crying. He patted the little helpless animal, who responded by wagging his tail. The narrator then thought and told Tricky that he knew that Tricky did not have any energy, but he surely had a way to get him better. As soon as they reached the hospital, all the other dogs gathered around the doctor. Tricky looked at all of them, and when the doctor put him down on the carpet, he could not even move. The other dogs then sniffed him and thought to themselves that he was a very uninteresting object, that there was no use standing there, and left. Then the narrator made the bed for Tricky in a warm box along with the other dogs. For 2 days, the narrator kept him just on water and nothing else. On the second day, he roamed around looking at the place around him, and on the third day, he was also making noise to let the people in the hospital know that he too wanted to go out with the other dogs. When the narrator opened the door, Tricky quickly came out and was surrounded by Joe, who was a greyhound, and his friends. Again, after sniffing him for a moment, all of them left for the garden, when Tricky followed them. Later in the evening, the narrator was present at the dinner time and was watching all of them, especially Tristan as he was slopping the food. All of them were eating with great speed because they knew that if they did not finish quickly, then the other dog, after finishing his meal, would come to eat their meal. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medical treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, trampled on, and squashed every few minutes. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at meal times and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background. ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. When everybody finished their food, Tricky went round looking at the shining bowls and also licked a few bowls. The very next day, an extra bowl was put for him, and the narrator was happy to see him running towards his bowl. Then he started getting better really quick. He did not require any medicines and started playing with the other dogs the whole day. They all used to play with each other, bump into each other, walk over each other, and squash each other. All of the other dogs accepted him as a family member, although he was very different from others, as he was very well taken care of by his owner, and the others were not. He also used to fight for his meals with his fellow dogs, who were much larger in size than him. At night, he would also hunt rats in the hen house. He was enjoying as he had never done such things before. All this while, Mrs. Pumphrey used to call more than 12 times a day to inquire about Tricky. Mrs. Harriet used to avoid questions about the court, bets, etc. But he told her that Tricky was doing very good and was recovering very fast. Mrs. Pumphrey wanted Tricky to recover fast. She started sending 2 dozen eggs every day for him, but Mr. Harriet and his partners would have 2 eggs each for breakfast. Then, to improve the quality of blood, Mrs. Pumphrey started sending in bottles of wine. Then it became Mr. Harriet's habit to have 2 glasses of wine before lunch and few along with it. Means those wines and eggs was utilized and consumed by Mr. Harriet. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final age on Tricky's constitution. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. They were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. It was a temptation to keep Tricky as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better? Yes, he is fine. There is no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dog was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard muscle animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled "Oh!" and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, and bowls, none of which had been used. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Harriet, she cried, how can I ever thank you? This is the word meanings. Mrs. Pumphrey started sending in brandy, At that time, Mr. Harriet was not able to believe that Mrs. Pumphrey actually wanted them to give brandy to Tricky. They shared it amongst themselves, means Mr. Harriet and other members. Some days Mr. Harriet used to feel very happy as he would start his day with extra eggs. Then he would have a few glasses of wine in the afternoon and then ending the day with brandy in the evening. Because of all things that were being sent for Tricky, Mr. Harriet was really tempted to keep him means to keep Tricky as a permanent guest at the surgery so that he will get all these brandy, eggs, wines. But Mr. Harriet was knowing that he wanted the Tricky should stay with them forever. But he realized that Mrs. Pumphrey, who was like a mother to Tricky, was really suffering and really wanted Tricky to come back soon. After 15 days, Tricky was ready to go back home, and Mr. Harriet called up Mrs. Pumphrey to come pick him up. Within a few minutes, a long black car came outside. When the chauffeur opened the door, Mrs. Pumphrey was sitting inside, really nervous as well as excited. She was asking with her nervousness in her voice, "That was Tricky really better?" To which the doctor replied positively. Then Mr. Harriet went inside to get Tricky. When Mr. Harriet went to the garden behind the house, he saw all the dogs moving round in the garden, and Tricky was sitting between them. He had recovered wonderfully in 2 weeks. He was looking much healthier, playing with the other dogs, and his chest was touching the ground. He had become a good muscular dog within 2 weeks. When Mr. Harriet took Tricky to the front of the house, he saw that the chauffeur was still holding the door of the car, and as soon as Tricky saw his mother like mistress, he was overjoyed. He ran away and jumped into the lap of Mrs. Pumphrey and started licking her face, barking in excitement. While all this was happening, the chauffeur and Mr. Harriet got all his stuff out to the car which had not been used during the treatment in the last 14 days. When Mrs. Pumphrey was leaving, she leaned out of the window and said to Mr. Harriet with tears of joy in her eyes that she could not thank him enough for what he had done. This is a triumph of surgery, meant that the treatment that was given to Tricky had been successful. So, this was the story. Now, the summary is the story starts when Mrs. Pumphrey, a rich lady, takes her dog out for a walk. A nearby veterinary doctor who knows the lady sees the dog and is shocked as he sees that the dog looks like a blotted sausage with a leg at each end. He advises her to stop giving him unhealthy things to eat, but Mrs. Pumphrey is not able to refuse him. Soon he falls sick and the doctor is called. The narrator, Mr. Harriet, then somehow takes Tricky the dog to the hospital even though he knows that Mrs. Pumphrey is not ready to leave her dog and nearly fainted just by hearing these words. Then he takes the dog along and puts a bed for him in his surgery. The dog does not move much nor eats anything for the first 2 days. On the second day, he looks around and whimpers a bit. He wanted to go out on the third day and started playing with the bigger dogs when he was taken out. He also licked the bowls of other dogs clean on the third day. Then his condition started improving very fast. He started fighting for his meals with other dogs. Then, when this news reached Mrs. Pumphrey, she started sending him eggs as she thought that Tricky was recovering from an illness and needed energy foods. Mr. Harriet and his partners started eating those eggs for morning breakfast. Then, for improving Tricky's blood, Mrs. Pumphrey started sending in bottles of wine, which was again consumed by Mr. Harriet. He used to take 2 glasses before lunch and some more glasses while having lunch. Then, when she started sending in bottles of brandy for Tricky, that was the time when Mr. Harriet thought that he would really like to keep Tricky as a permanent guest in the surgery. Mr. Harriet used to be really happy someday by having 2 extra eggs every morning, then having few glasses of wine in the afternoon, and closing the day by having brandy at night. But then he took a wise decision and called up Mrs. Pumphrey as she was really worried, and on this side, Tricky was ready to be taken back home. Tricky was really happy to see his mistress and jumped into the car. Mrs. Pumphrey said that she won't be able to ever thank Mr. Harriet for what he had done, and also that his surgery had been successful, as Tricky was now cured. So, this was the story. I hope this will help you out to understand. Thank you.